Well, good afternoon, Memorial Day. There's a picture of the Pentagon, um, which was taken in 2004 from Columbia Pike. That's my high school, which had very meritocratic values. That was when I graduated in 1961. I've been through. There's an Army uniform. There's another Army uniform. This is in a museum in Columbia, South Carolina, near There's the entrance to Fort Jackson, where I had basic training. There's the cemetery at Fort Jackson. A lot of young men and sometimes women have given their lives, and it's New York and the NIH and the Cast Iron Building. That's near where the Ninth Street Center was, and I thought I would just add that was the doorway to it in in the early 1970s. And I just wanted to talk about a few things, mainly creativity. There's this book that I've mentioned before, Homosexuality, the Psychology of the Creative Process by Paul Rosenfels with an introduction by Dean Hannett. And there are three parts to the book. 1972, I'm going to read it backwards, but the nature of polarity, the psychological defenses, and the creative process. And this book is quite remarkable. Um, every paragraph there'll be a feminine version. He talks about the polarities, feminine, masculine, and then being objective or subjective, the four temperaments. So that's four combinations. And there'll be a feminine paragraph, and then the same sentences will be rewritten from a masculine perspective. And what he means by the creative process is kind of the opposite of what he was doing. He was writing a very abstract, almost like a mathematical proof in this book, um, and doing his own work, and we call that creative, writing books like my own Do Ask Do Tell books and everything. We think of that as creative. But to him, creativity was interpersonal, that you did things by your interactions with other people. You made yourself important to other people and made other people important to you. And you actually justified your involvement in things by the responsibilities you had for other people, not just because you thought about or thought you were right about something. And that's a tough thing to swallow. If you are conventionally married heterosexually with children, with a family, that gives you a lot of agency, that defines your responsibility for others, and it also provides you a way to provide for others who are less able to take care of themselves, and maybe even relatives that are less able to marry and have children, but keep them in your family the way things used to be. Keep them as support for the family that you have command of, and that gives you a sense of power and agency, and you're taking care of other people, so it makes it real. So the creativity of this comes if don't have your own children, maybe you adopt children, but particularly for homosexuals, and this was in the early 1970s, 1970, 1972 was when no, 1973, April 1973 was when I first heard about the center from Dean Hannett after my second coming, so to speak. If you um, are living that life, if you want to be important to other people, you actually have to um, reach out to them and make a positive effort to step up to challenges when they come your way, and where you can actually be responsible for someone. I might have been able to do that in 2016 when I was still in the House, with respect to the asylum seekers. And that was the year Trump, of course, won the election. And I kind of stalled around and never quite did it, and then wound up moving out of the House, making it look better in 2017. I never really quite lived up to it. So when I write my fourth book, it seems like it is an exercise in just proving you're right. But that isn't what he meant. Creativity actually was in terms of your responsibility for other people when you do not have the normal social supports that come from traditional heterosexual marriage. And so then the other thing that's quite remarkable, the polarities, in the 1970s became the performativities, which are like a derivative of polarity, so to speak, sense of calculus. In the 1990s with Judith Butler, and then um, in the 2010s, the late 2010s, activists started to want, when it started, that became gender identity, and then the activists wanted people to make that public. And in the most extreme case, wanted gender identity to um, overtake sex, replace sex, which is something that's a lot more radical than simply taking care of maybe a young person who, for some reason that you can prove medically, actually has severe dysphoria, and you can actually prove it. And that's very rare, although there are cases. This is more like a political movement that's a little bit kind of like, sounds like it's Marxism, and it is. But one of the things that I just thought I would also mention that the American Medical Association back in um, 2021 had stated that biological sex should no longer be publicly published on birth certificates, which is, and the Yogyakarta principle, the second set of them back in 2017, that plus 10 set, principle 31, I think it was, said something very similar, that biological sex or that gender should be essentially be self-ID'd, and that sex should not have to be made public. It essentially implied that, which has been a surprise to a lot of people to find out. So the idea that what I used to call polarity in the early 1970s, when I came out, and was associated with Rosenfels, and I wasn't that creative. And in fact, one of the worst things, of course, is cherry picking in a relationship. Only being willing to have relationships with people who you feel are better than you are or more attractive than you are, which is very common in the male gay community, which is the worst possible sin in their world. You can imagine why it would be. So cherry picking is another important concept that is viewed negatively. But I thought I would also go back and stress that when I was growing up, the attitude was, when you were particularly when you were in high school started in 10th grade, and junior high was 7th or 9th, but even in 9th grade, it was kind of starting, and now it's 9th grade. You were proving yourself academically. You were, by getting good grades, and then that would continue in college, particularly with the way college was back then in the early 60s. You were proving that you were worthier than other people for an upper class job in society, for a white collar job, for not being part of the union or regiment workforce or manual labor workforce, or people who had to do regimented jobs for a living, but we were better than that. And we're going to have a better life than those people did. You were actually, when you got grades on tests in high school, that's what you were proving. I remember the first time I had final exams in high school was 10th grade, because it was in high school. Having a set of final exams in early or mid-June was a new experience, and going through it for the first time was a real initiation. But you were proving your worth to go to college and be better than other people. That was how we thought. And particularly with young men who were male, being able to be treated better if they were drafted, in the Vietnam, of course, Johnson upped the draft calls. There was some draft even when I was in college, started college myself in 61. But of course, President Johnson, after the Kennedy assassination, after Vietnam started increasing, particularly in early 1965, and kept on increased the draft calls rapidly, and we had student deferments. But previously, there had been marriage deferments and or then marriage if you had children, and that was gotten rid of, and it was just student deferments. And then in December of 1969, it was replaced by a lottery. But for several years, it was student deferments, kind of implied if you stayed in college and majored in math and science, you'd be okay. You wouldn't have to be drafted and be asked to sacrifice yourself or risk yourself in war. That was what we were doing for a few years. So the people that had better grades and were brainier, that maybe weren't quite as physical, were still considered better people, which of course is eating into the old idea of masculinity being worshipped for some sake just a little bit. That was kind of an irony of the time. But every male was vulnerable, had to prove himself capable of fighting for his country, or was considered to be a less valuable person, unless they got good grades in college or something. And I wound up in the Army in 1968. I wound up in special training company for 4 weeks. I've talked about that, and I talked to a couple other people that were in special that were stuck in it for 6 months, who should probably have physical problems that probably should never have been drafted. They were being punished for not being male enough, And so you can understand then why some people would want to get rid of sex as a legal qualifier and want to replace it with gender identity, which more or less equates to what we used to call polarity in the 1970s at the 9th Street Center. So I just thought I would just go over that again today. And again, what creativity meant to Paul Rosenfels and some of his concepts that had to be based on interactions with real people, even though Paul himself didn't always completely live up to it. And I certainly haven't lived up to it. And then this idea of the resentment of cherry picking, even in dating, and some of the behavior recently and all the controversy over trans has been about that. So I just thought I would talk about that today just a little bit on Memorial Day. And I do thank you for listening.